A veteran was humiliated at a medical center. Everyone saw it, but no one moved. And then, by a stroke of luck, Sylvester Stallone appeared at that very moment, and everything changed. No one who witnessed it could ever forget. If this story touches you, please hit the subscribe button. And don't forget to leave a comment below to share your thoughts, your experiences, or simply a message of support for our heroes. That's exactly what happened on a late Friday afternoon at the VA West Los Angeles Medical Center. The waiting room was packed, the air thick with impatience and the bitter smell of burnt coffee. Veterans slumped in battered chairs, staring at a digital board flashing patient numbers caught in what seemed like an endless loop. No one smiled. No one laughed. Everyone was just waiting, to be seen, to be acknowledged. Frank Lewis, a 68-year-old retired Marine, sat quietly near the entrance, clutching a manila folder tightly in his calloused hands. His body still held the strength of years past, but his shoulders sagged under the weight of too many broken promises. Today, he wasn't asking for much, only the medication that had been prescribed to him months ago. But when his number flashed and he approached the front desk, it didn't take long for dignity to be stripped away. Trent Walker, the young receptionist, barely glanced at him before sighing loudly. "Name and last four," he barked. Frank provided his information, standing patiently as Trent clicked away at the keyboard. Seconds passed, then minutes. Trent frowned, his typing turning more aggressive. Without even looking up, he said, "You're not in the system. Probably messed up your paperwork." Frank blinked, confused. "I filled everything out last week, sir. They told me it was all good." Trent shrugged, completely devoid of sympathy. "Well, they were wrong. You'll have to fill it out again. Maybe this time, pay better attention, old man." The words hit harder than necessary. Frank clenched his jaw, fighting to maintain his composure. "Could you check again? I've been coming here 20 years. Never had an issue before." Trent leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking. "Hey, I don't make the rules. If you can't keep up, that's your problem, not mine." Frank felt humiliation creeping up his neck. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't demanding special treatment. All he wanted was what he had earned, what he had sacrificed so much for. Around him, a few patients glanced up, but quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. That was when Frank asked, in a steady but quiet voice, "Can I speak to a supervisor?" Trent rolled his eyes dramatically and called for Ms. Hart over the intercom, his voice dripping with mockery. Minutes later, Ms. Hart appeared, a woman in her early 50s, sharp in her neat blazer, a lanyard declaring, "Serving those who served." She listened to Trent's version of events with visible impatience, barely masking her annoyance. Turning to Frank, she offered a tight, fake smile. "Sir, if your paperwork is incomplete, you'll need to resubmit. That's policy." Frank tried to explain again, pulling out the appointment slip he had carefully saved. "Ma'am, I did everything I was told to do. I even double-checked before I left last week." Ms. Hart didn't even glance at the paper. She straightened her posture and, loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear, said, "If you can't follow basic instructions, you'll have to come back another day." A wave of discomfort rippled through the room, but no one moved. Frank's hands shook slightly as he tucked the folder back under his arm. He felt small, invisible, forgotten. Just then, a calm but unmistakable voice cut through the heavy air like a knife. Is that really how we treat our veterans? Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. There stood Sylvester Stallone. No entourage, no flashing cameras. Just a man in a black shirt and jeans, his sharp eyes locked onto the scene. For a moment, no one moved, as if time itself had frozen. Ms. Hart's mouth opened and closed without sound. Trent shifted back nervously from the counter. Stallone strode forward, slow and deliberate, his every step commanding the room without a single raised word. When he reached Frank's side, he turned to Ms. Hart, his voice calm but cold. This man wore our country's uniform. He put his life on the line, and you're treating him like he's a burden? Ms. Hart stammered. Mr. Stallone, with all due respect, we have procedures. And somewhere in those procedures, Stallone interrupted, his voice dropping dangerously low, does it say to humiliate the ones who fought for you? The entire room fell silent. Even the old TV in the corner seemed to hush. Trent looked ready to vanish. Frank stood there, stunned, unable to believe what was unfolding. Stallone turned briefly to Frank, giving him a respectful nod before focusing back on the counter. Pull up his file, Stallone ordered. Trent hesitated, glancing at Ms. Hart, who gave a rigid nod. With trembling hands, Trent entered Frank's name. After a long moment, the screen lit up. Trent swallowed hard. His file is complete. It's the system. It didn't update properly after the last maintenance cycle. Stallone allowed a small, humorless smile. So, it wasn't his mistake. Ms. Hart cleared her throat awkwardly. It seems it wasn't. Stallone's eyes stayed locked onto hers. Then fix it. Around them, the veterans who had once looked away now watched, something fierce awakening in tired faces. Ms. Hart attempted a brittle smile. Of course, we'll fix it right away. Stallone gave a sharp nod but wasn't done. He looked around the waiting room, meeting every eye. If you forget to honor the ones who fought for your freedom, he said quietly, then you don't deserve the freedom they bled for. His words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Slowly, the veterans straightened in their seats. Some nodded. Some pressed their lips together. All of them felt it, the simple, irrefutable truth of what he had said. Stallone turned back to Frank, clapped him gently on the shoulder, and said, "You are not invisible. Not today, not ever." For the first time in years, Frank felt like he stood taller. Not because of anger, not because of pride, but because someone had remembered. Someone had cared enough to say it out loud, and it was someone the whole world would listen to. Ms. Hart's fingers trembled slightly as she motioned for Trent to correct the file. Frank stood by, silent, unsure whether to believe what was happening. Trent's face flushed a deep red as he clicked through the system, muttering under his breath. Stallone watched without saying a word, his presence alone enough to make every move feel 1,000 pounds heavier. When Trent finally confirmed that Frank's medication was authorized and ready, Stallone gave him a nod as if dismissing a wayward soldier from formation. Frank offered a polite thank you to the counter, his voice low but clear. Stallone looked over the room again, his gaze landing on the other veterans sitting in silence, some with canes, some with prosthetics, some with scars you could not see. He gestured lightly with one hand, his voice carrying across the waiting room without needing to be raised. If they can't fix it for one Marine, how many others have they ignored? A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet but undeniable. Stallone didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned back to Frank. Come on, let's make sure they don't just shuffle the problem into the back office. Without thinking, Frank nodded and followed Stallone around the side of the counter toward a row of private cubicles meant for patient consultations. Ms. Hart moved to intercept them, but hesitated under Stallone's unwavering stare. A nurse, middle-aged and wearing scrubs patterned with tiny American flags, glanced up and recognized the gravity of the moment. She quickly motioned them into a side office, closing the door gently behind them. Inside, Stallone pulled out a chair for Frank, with a casual respect that didn't feel rehearsed. Frank sat slowly, his knees aching from too many decades of rough landings and long marches. Stallone remained standing, arms crossed, as the nurse brought up Frank's full medical file on her computer. She reviewed it carefully, her brows knitting together as she scrolled. "It looks like there were changes to the prescription refill policies 2 months ago," she said softly, almost embarrassed. "The system was supposed to migrate veteran accounts automatically, but it looks like a lot of them were missed." Stallone tilted his head slightly. "And nobody thought to check?" The nurse shook her head, biting her lip. "They were understaffed, budget cuts, lots of new hires. Things fell through the cracks." Stallone didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, the weight of his disappointment filling the small room. After a moment, he leaned down, tapping lightly on the desk. "You realize what that means for guys like Frank? Missing meds, missing appointments, losing benefits they fought for." The nurse's eyes shimmered with guilt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Frank cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. "Ma'am, we're used to getting overlooked, but that doesn't make it right." Stallone gave him a nod of quiet approval. Outside the small office, the atmosphere in the waiting room had shifted. Word had spread fast. More veterans were standing now, forming a loose cluster near the reception desk, speaking in hushed but firm voices. Stallone and Frank stepped back into the lobby to find Ms. Hart trying desperately to calm the growing unrest. She forced a bright, brittle smile when she saw Stallone. "We're handling everything, Mr. Stallone. No need to cause a disruption." Stallone walked forward, stopping inches from her. His voice was still low, still calm, but it carried the sharp edge of a man who knew what injustice looked like and what it cost. "You already caused the disruption when you treated a man like a number instead of a person." Ms. Hart's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Stallone turned to the gathered veterans. "How many of you have had a problem here in the last few months? Show of hands." Nearly every hand in the room rose slowly. Some lifted stiffly, some defiantly, but they rose all the same. Ms. Hart's smile collapsed completely. Stallone scanned the room, locking eyes with every single one of them. "This isn't just about Frank. It's about all of you. You were promised something when you put on that uniform, and it wasn't to be treated like an inconvenience." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, low murmurs growing louder. Someone near the back, a man in an army jacket too thin for winter, called out, "Tell him, Sly!" There was a smattering of laughter, but it was a hard, bitter sound, like relief breaking through years of frustration. Ms. Hart pulled out her cell phone, muttering something about calling administration. Stallone didn't flinch. He turned toward a young woman standing to the side, her phone already raised, recording everything. He gave her a small nod. "Let them see," he said simply. "Let everyone see." The woman's hands steadied as she continued to film. Stallone faced the front desk again, voice rising just enough to carry. "The next time you're tempted to hide behind policy, remember that behind every file, every missed call, every clerical error, there's a real person who gave something you can never repay. Trent shifted uncomfortably, his face pale and sweaty. Ms. Hart looked ready to cry. Stallone's words weren't angry. They weren't shouted. They were worse than anger. They were truth. Hard, undeniable, and heavy. Frank watched all of it unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. No one had ever stood up for him like this. Not since the day he had signed his enlistment papers at 17 years old. Stallone stepped back, letting the weight of his words settle. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, one of the older veterans near the back started clapping. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. Just a slow, steady rhythm of hands coming together, heavy with meaning. Another vet joined in, then another, and another, until the entire waiting room was filled with the sound of applause, not for Stallone's fame, but for his courage. Ms. Hart finally found her voice. "We will be reviewing all veteran files immediately," she said, her voice shaking. "Any errors will be corrected. And I apologize for the way Mr. Lewis was treated." She turned to Frank, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, sir." Frank gave her a small, gracious nod. He didn't need groveling, just acknowledgement, just respect. Stallone clapped him lightly on the back. "About damn time," he muttered, and Frank chuckled, the sound rusty but real. Stallone turned back to the crowd, tipping an invisible hat. "Take care of each other," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out of the VA, leaving behind a room forever changed. Not because he made a speech, not because he was a star, but because he had reminded everyone what real honor looked like. Frank stood there a long moment, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. Maybe the world hadn't forgotten after all. Maybe someone was still willing to fight for the fighters. Outside the VA building, the late afternoon sun dipped low behind the palm trees lining Wilshire Boulevard, casting long shadows across the pavement. Sylvester Stallone didn't pause as he stepped into the fading light. He simply pulled a plain baseball cap over his head and disappeared into the city crowds as quietly as he had arrived. Inside, Frank Lewis remained standing near the reception desk, the manila folder still tucked under his arm, but somehow it felt lighter now, as if the years of being overlooked had been peeled away with a single act of courage. Around him, the veterans were buzzing in hushed conversations, not just about Stallone, but about themselves, their rights, their worth. For too long they had sat quietly in places like this, letting small humiliations pile up into silent mountains of resentment. But something had shifted in those few minutes. Veterans who had once stared at the floor now stood a little straighter, looked each other in the eye, and spoke in voices that didn't apologize for taking up space. Ms. Hart retreated into her office with trembling hands, issuing orders over the phone for immediate file audits, while Trent typed feverishly at his computer, his earlier arrogance now replaced with the frantic energy of a man trying to undo a mistake too big to hide. News traveled fast in places like this. By the time Frank made it to the parking lot, a small crowd had gathered outside, where a few younger vets, some older ones leaning heavily on canes, and even a nurse or two who had witnessed the scene. They greeted him with nods, quiet pats on the back, and a few firm handshakes. Frank accepted them with humility, his weathered face creasing into a smile that felt almost unfamiliar. One young man in a battered army hoodie, maybe no older than Frank had been when he enlisted, approached him with wide eyes. "Sir," the young man said, voice cracking slightly. "Thank you," for everything you did, and for letting him stand up for you." Frank chuckled, a low rumble from deep in his chest. "Son," he said, clapping the kid gently on the shoulder, "sometimes the hardest thing in the world is just standing there and letting someone fight alongside you." The young man grinned, his chest puffing up a little. Frank watched him go with a strange sense of hope blooming in his chest, a feeling he hadn't tasted in a long, long time. Over the next few days, the story exploded. A blurry cell phone video showing Stallone confronting the staff went viral, racking up millions of views on YouTube, Facebook, and local news broadcasts. Anchors marveled at how Stallone, a man famous for portraying tough guys, had proven his real strength was his heart. Commentators debated the state of the VA system, calling for sweeping reforms. Editorials praised Frank Lewis by name, though Frank himself hadn't sought any spotlight and certainly hadn't given a single interview. At home, Frank's phone rang off the hook. Reporters, veterans groups, even a few politicians eager to get a quote. Frank answered very few of them. He didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the men and women sitting in VA waiting rooms across the country, wondering if anyone still saw them. A few days later, a package arrived at Frank's modest home in Van Nuys. It was a thick envelope stamped with the logo of Balboa Productions, Stallone's film company. Inside, nestled between a letter and a photograph, was a single note, handwritten in a neat, blocky script. "Frank, men like you don't ask for attention. You earn it. You remind the rest of us what it means to stand for something. Thanks for letting me stand with you. Sly." Frank sat at his kitchen table for a long time, just staring at the note. Finally, he set it down gently and opened the accompanying envelope to find 2 tickets to an upcoming charity event honoring veterans at the Dolby Theater. "No cameras," the note promised. "Just a chance to be recognized properly." Frank didn't care much for fancy events, but something about the gesture touched him deeper than he could explain. That Saturday, wearing his best and only dark suit and a Marine Corps pin polished to a dull shine, Frank made his way to Hollywood. The Dolby Theater gleamed under the city lights, but inside the atmosphere was warm, almost familial. No red carpets, no flashing paparazzi, just veterans, families, old friends reconnecting over memories, and lost time. When Frank entered the main hall, heads turned. Not because he was famous, but because people recognized something else in him, something earned through hardship, through perseverance, through a life lived with quiet dignity. Stallone found him near the refreshment table, nursing a lukewarm coffee. He wore a simple dark blazer and jeans, blending in as much as a man like him could. When their eyes met, Stallone smiled, a genuine, no movie star smile, and walked over. "Glad you came," he said, holding out his hand. Frank took it in a firm grip, feeling the strength there, not just in muscle, but in spirit. "Wasn't sure I belonged," Frank admitted gruffly. Stallone clapped him on the back with a chuckle. "Frank, if you don't belong here, none of us do." They talked for a while, not about movies or fame or viral videos, but about life, about service, about the strange, winding paths that bring people together when they need it most. Stallone introduced Frank to others, Medal of Honor recipients, nurses, volunteers, young veterans just starting their civilian lives. Everywhere Frank went that night, he found respect, not because Stallone had given it to him, but because he had reminded others why it had always been his. Toward the end of the evening, Stallone took the stage briefly. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't make it about himself. He simply said, "Tonight's about remembering that strength isn't about who yells the loudest or hits the hardest. Real strength is about standing up for someone who can't fight alone. And sometimes it's about letting others stand with you." He paused, letting the words settle, then nodded toward Frank in the audience. To the men and women who stood tall when it mattered most, thank you. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't wild. It was steady, heartfelt, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. Frank rose slowly from his seat, feeling a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down the way he had learned to do in harder days. He nodded once toward the stage, a silent salute to a man who didn't have to care, but did anyway. In the weeks that followed, policies at the VA clinic changed. Staff were retrained. Veterans were given new hotlines to report mistreatment. More importantly, a new attitude began to take root, not just in that one building, but across the network. Maybe change wouldn't come overnight. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect, but it had started. And sometimes, Frank thought as he sat on his porch with a fresh cup of coffee and the evening breeze ruffling the newspaper at his feet, that's all it took. One voice refusing to be silent. One act of courage inspiring 100 more. As the sun dipped below the Los Angeles skyline, Frank leaned back, savoring the simple peace of a hard-fought day. He wasn't invisible, not anymore. He had been seen, and he had been valued. And thanks to a man who had once fought imaginary wars on silver screens, the real battles, the ones that mattered most, had been honored at last. This is not just a story about a Marine veteran who was humiliated in a waiting room. It's a story about how silence, indifference, and routine can erode the very respect we claim to hold for those who served. Frank Lewis wasn't asking for praise. He wasn't demanding recognition. All he wanted was to be seen, to be treated with the same basic dignity he had fought to defend for others. But sometimes, in the places where honor should live, like the halls of a VA medical center, respect gets buried beneath paperwork, policy, and people too tired or too indifferent to care. And that's when silence becomes complicity. What happened that afternoon was a reminder of how fragile dignity can be when no one speaks up, and how powerful it becomes when someone does. Sylvester Stallone didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply stood beside a man who had been forgotten and reminded the world that no one who wore the uniform should ever feel invisible. That single act of courage did more than fix a mistake. It shifted the room. It awakened something in everyone watching, something that's often buried deep in all of us. The need to stand for what's right, even when it's not our battle, especially then. This story is not about celebrity. It's not about going viral. It's about what happens when one person chooses to see, to care, and to act. If this story moved you, let it be more than a moment. Let it be a mirror. Ask yourself who you would be in that room. Silent observer, indifferent worker, or someone who steps forward. Because our heroes don't stop needing us when they take off the uniform. And sometimes the greatest kind of strength is the kind that lifts someone else.